Welcome back to Healthy Living Resources. This month, we're joined by Marion County Extension Educator Whitney Gherman, who will be discussing somatic awareness with us, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living Resources. Like I said, we are joined this month by Whitney Gherman, Marion County Extension Educator. Welcome, Whitney. So I guess before we jump into the topic, let's just take a couple of minutes and maybe just tell our viewers why it is you chose to talk about somatic awareness.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. Why I talked about this, I just think about the year of 2020, and our communities have been faced with so many contentious issues and self-examination. Online, in person, we're debating about mask or no mask, Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, vote red, vote blue, and it just seems like maybe it seems simple that we should all get along, but it does require some skill, relationship building, and healing. So this topic is really meaningful for the times that we're in.
That's great. So when you talk about somatic awareness, I know that before I heard you talking about it for the first time, this was a term that I was super unfamiliar with. So I think before we kind of jump into what this means and how we're reacting to things, maybe just kind of give our viewers a little insight into what exactly this term is referring to.
Yeah, that's a great question. So soma is a Greek word for body. So when we talk about somatic awareness, we're talking about body-based awareness. A lot of times in the work that we do with extension and just any kind of work in the community, we tend to focus heavily on the brain, and we neglect what the body's knowledge is. And, as we've seen in these contentious issues, we've tried tackling them with education and with mental training, but it's not working as well as we'd expect. And so I'm really interested in how we might use somatic awareness to connect with our needs and our values and really align our commitments as a society using our body-based awareness.
That's really interesting. So, I think this year is probably, like you said, the perfect time for us to be diving into this specific topic. And it sounds like what you're saying is, so when we engage in one of these like really difficult topics, it can be really hard to, have these conversations and remain calm. And a lot of people feel maybe inclined to react. They're, reacting to certain topics or certain, trigger words or whatever it is. And it sounds like that's our body's response to these topics. And I know I've heard you say that this is like the body's knowledge. What does that mean? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, we can think about the body. We have a vagus nerve that runs from the top of our head down our spine, and it really signals these responses to our nervous system, and that shows up in our body in ways of sweaty palms or fast heart rate. These are all examples of our body's knowledge signaling something to us. And often we overlook these signals, but they have so much information to offer us. Just thinking about the example you gave of a stimulus, scrolling through your Facebook feed, seeing a viral video, there's something that's going on in our body when we're doing that, but we're often just not aware. And so part of the somatic work is slowing down and paying attention to these responses, and kind of without any judgment, just noticing what's happening, what's going on, and what that might mean.
That's great. So we can become aware, I think, of what you're saying, these responses. How do we learn what they mean? How do we learn to listen to them?
Yeah, so what we'll do now is kind of talk about the different states of our brain, because I think our brain informs, part of the rest of our bodies. And if you want to pull up the slide, we can look here at these illustrations that they're very simplified versions of the brain for you. So I'm not a neuroscience or anything like that, but this is supposed to give you an overview of what's going on when we experience or perceive a threat that could be real or misconstrued in our minds. Yeah, that's great. So this is just the big overview. This is your brain. Imagine this is your brain, right? It's not doodled this way, but this is a simplified version. And the first part of the brain that we're going to look at, and we can go to the next slide, is the brain stem. I'm always pointing back here because this is where it lives in the lower level of our brain. This I'm calling our self-protective state. So we can think of, in the next few slides, I'm referring to 3 parts. And this is the first part. This is our survival instinct. So in this part of our brain, we are, it's very instinctual. It's not something we think about. It's like our respiration. And it's also where our fight, flight, or freeze response comes in. So, as I said before, a threat can be real or perceived. And that includes threats to what we think about, care about, or believe in. So when we see something online, maybe something we disagree with, our brain is responding in this fight, flight, or freeze. Here's another example. If you've ever tried to debate with someone or argue with someone on social media, it probably wasn't successful because most people online are operating on this very basic level. And our reasoning abilities at this state are very limited. Like I said before, the things that are increased are fear, our anger, our anxiety, our heart rate, our blood pressure. And so it also means that the things that are decreased is our concentration, our reasoning abilities, our attention span, our coping skills, listening, comprehension, etc. Shame also operates in this state, and I think that's really important to notice because a lot of us feel shame when we talk about issues. For example, when we talk about racism, a lot of us might feel a lot of shame around that. The important thing to know, though, is that we can soothe our survival state or our self-protective state. There are things that we can do, particularly the ones I reference are related to somatics, to provide that part of the brain a sense of safety. And when it's provided a sense of safety, then we get to move to the next part of the brain, which is our emotional state. And you can show that on the next slide. This is where our emotions live. So this is thinking about not just our emotions, but also our memory. And when we enter these conversations, we already have memories associated with the topic. So I'm going to again reference racism because it just seems like a really relevant topic right now. All of us have learned about racism at least some point in our life, whether we agree that it exists or we disagree that it exists, we have a memory with that. And with that memory, we've already associated certain images, characteristics, or patterns. And even we have memories that show up based on personal experience. So keeping that in mind, our bias also lives here in our amygdala. Actually, they've done brain scans before, and it showed high levels of amygdala activation when people were shown pictures of African American men. At the same time, when they were shown images of white men, the brain scans did not show a high level of amygdala activation. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how I'm controlling my amygdala, right? Like this is all just automatic, nothing that we've done specifically to control it, but there are ways that we can change our brain's chemistry. And one way with the amygdala to soothe it, because it's craving connection. So we can soothe that emotional state through connection and a sense of belonging. And when you look at other cultures, particularly South Africa and Ubuntu principles, and we look at indigenous cultures, this sense of belonging is indisputable. It's just kind of known and respected. In Western society, it's a little different. We've emphasized individualism so much. And so how might we restore that sense of belonging and restore healing that happens in relationship? The one thing I do want to pay attention to when we give examples on race and racism is that it's really important for white people to tolerate their own experience and to tolerate the emotions and stress that we feel from our self-protective survival instinct. Because if we don't, we might overtly manipulate or use power to relieve our distress. In other words, we might look for people of color to serve or soothe these responses. So it's really important that we actually are the ones responsible for taking control of our emotions and our survival instincts so that we can access this last state of the brain, which I'm calling the curious state or the creative state. This is known also as our prefrontal cortex. This is where we can problem solve and where it's optimal for learning. So at this state, we're able to tolerate a little bit more stress, right? We can access the part of our brain that allows us to engage in difficult conversations and think of solutions. So again, thinking about that example of someone posting something on Facebook, you're probably not going to rationalize with solutions at this part of the brain, but here we might be able to. And here, it's not only that we're regulating ourselves to neutrality. I don't think that's the goal. I think our goal here is that we challenge norms. We acknowledge danger that is really real for some people. Survival is essential for Black and brown bodies. And in this state of the brain, we also embrace the struggle and we take risk. So this is where I hope our communities can live more is in this curious, creative state of the brain. And I'll share in a few moments some ways that maybe we can get there.
All right, thanks, Whitney. I'm going to stop sharing. So I think that is really kind of eye-opening as you kind of walk through the different brain states. So it seems like a lot of us are operating in that first state, that like fight, flight, or freeze, right? And I think that is, like you said, really apparent to us when we're scrolling through social media or we're engaging just with other people in general, where it's really hard to connect. It's really hard, I think, for a lot of us to know how to get out of that state. So if we need to be operating in that last brain state, how do we move from that reactive, that fight, flight, or freeze state into where we can be a lot more connected to what's happening and not so reactive to it?
Yeah, because the unfortunate thing is that all of us have some level of trauma, especially right now, living with COVID-19 and civil unrest. Trauma impacts our brain's development, especially in young people. Young people haven't even developed the front of their brain until they're 25. And so I remember myself on social media as a young person. God, I hope no one looks up my name on social media after this and finds things that I've probably posted because I lack those reasoning abilities. And so I want to acknowledge that some of this gets disrupted, but there are ways that we can ground ourselves. And so some ways that we can do that is first by tracking, which is really this, and this is very, these are interventions that are very personal, right? Like we're not talking big community-wide policy, societal level. This is what you and I can do with what we have right now. And so part of it is bringing attention to your body or tracking what you feel in your body at the moment, bringing attention to the bottom of your feet. I mean, even notice now, where are your feet planted? How might you plant both feet on the ground to give yourself some more groundedness? And from that, move from the bottom of your body to the top of your head, noticing each sensation. what this does is help build resiliency and hardiness in your nervous system. We can actually change our nervous system, and we can change the plasticity in our brain so that we don't have to rely on this survival instinct so much. And by tracking our sensations, we can also use discernment. We can discern if a threat to us is real or perceived. The other thing we can do is ground ourselves. So trauma can knock us off our feet, right? And these events can really make us feel like just being thrashed around. At least that's how I've described it. And so we might find something physically to connect us outside of our bodies in these moments. Even on calls that we might be on for work or whatnot, and it can be online or in person, is when those heated moments come up, finding a chair to sit on and anchor yourself in. I'm doing this with my arm because I have a chair underneath me and I'm holding on to the arm handles tightly. That can help us feel more grounded and feel connected to something. The other thing we can do is called resourcing. And that means that we invite in the sensations around us and bring attention to positive factors that restore our curiosity and sense of safety. This doesn't mean that we avoid difficult thoughts or we just paint a rosy picture. It just means that we're balancing things out. And this kind of relates to the shift and stay activity too, where we shift from tension anxiety to something more positive or neutral. So literally what this can mean is when you're feeling overwhelmed, especially if you have a device and you're looking at it, and I mean, it gives you tunnel vision. So putting that away for a moment and looking around, look at all around you. If you're in a room, notice the details as if you've never seen them before. And then do it in your body as well, from the bottom of your feet again to the top of your head. And then you can repeat it one more time because that might help you. The first time through, I noticed myself, I rush around pretty quickly. So it does help if you do it a few times. And even going outside, just giving a broader view just can help you shift and stay during those difficult moments.
So it sounds like, I know when I am scrolling through social media is my perfect example, because I think that that's one of those times lately where I find myself being very reactive to things. And so scrolling through, watching, reading the comment section, which is its own problem in itself, but feeling my reaction to those things, how I handled it was just removing myself from the platform in general, right? So deactivating that social media account so that I didn't have to feel that response. But it sounds like the proper, I think, approach to this, or a more maybe healthy approach to this, would be listening to your body in that moment and really trying to figure out how to make the most of those feelings so that you're not constantly living in that place, right? So rather than removing yourself from those topics or those spaces that might trigger that reaction from you, taking advantage of those times and learning how to listen to your body and become more resilient, I guess, in those moments, because not everything is like social media, right? So we can't remove ourselves from everything that makes us uncomfortable. So that, I think, is extremely helpful advice for many of us right now. I mean, I think all of us, whatever side we're on, in a lot of these instances, are feeling this reactive state. Yeah, I think that's really helpful for our viewers. So I know that you shared the wheel. How does that play into, I guess, all of this stuff?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead up and show
Sure.
the wheel, because I think this is a useful tool that you can use. Sometimes it's easy for us to identify our feelings but we don't necessarily know how to identify how those feelings make our body feel. And to your point, Amanda, as we understand our body's response, it also helps give us clarity for boundaries.
Mhm.
If you're constantly part of a Facebook group or in person and with a group of friends that's making your body have this negative reaction, you might consider whether you need resiliency or if you need boundaries, and maybe it's both. So if you pull up that wheel, we can take a look at that. And if you pull that up, I'll kind of explain that the feelings wheel was developed in the 80s, and it helped people identify and communicate their emotions. And then more recently, someone added this other layer of helping people identify the feelings and emotions. And what I've done here is kind of create some context, right? Because we're not just living this abstractly, we are surrounded by a social political context. And we're not just experiencing this individually either, like the other models assert. We experience this collectively as well. So this wheel is to help you identify, what are you feeling? How does that show up in your body? And then really think about the constructs around us and power and beliefs and bias that influence these feelings and body-based responses. Just as an example, in the United States, dominant bodies have imposed their, European, able-bodied, masculine characteristics on bodies of culture for centuries. And the more we know about trauma is it lives in the body and it's passed down generation to generation. So I think it's important to notice here this outer ring as well.
I think this is really, it's helpful and kind of eye-opening to look at, because I feel that sometimes when we are, feeling this reaction in our body to something, we make assumptions about what it is based on just familiarity with it. So my reaction to something I am assuming is anger, but if I'm looking here, maybe my reaction is actually fear, or maybe there's something else happening that I'm not as aware of. But if you can look at this outer ring, you can kind of see what your body's trying to tell you, right?
Absolutely. And maybe what messages you've received and who taught you to feel that way. I mean, not just who taught you, Malcolm X says, who taught you to hate yourself, but also like who taught you to feel good. I think Audre Lorde says something similar to that. And so understanding those messages that we've received, and a lot of times those messages come from when we're very young.
It feels like this whole process, all of it. So being aware of our bodies, understanding how to, being aware of our bodies and hearing what they're essentially trying to tell us about ourselves, right? And then having those techniques to ground ourselves or work past that is just this giant process of becoming aware of who we are and unlearning who we are and trying to uncover and dig up so that we can, I think, process all of this stuff a little bit more clear in a healthy way, right? What are some, for people who are joining us, and this is maybe the first time that they've really thought about this, because really this is it's a lot, right? In a good way. There's so much work to be done. What are some good, quick, takeaways that our viewers can take out into the world with them? What are some recommendations that you would make when they're feeling themselves being reactive? Where should their mind go first? Do we think about what it is that we're feeling and why we're feeling that? Do we learn to kind of cope with that and draw those boundaries first? What would be your recommendation for somebody who wants to take this, into their lives?
The first thing I would recommend is to slow down. Just slow down everything. Too quickly, we have stimulus and we respond. So if you can create more space between the two of those and just slow down, I think naturally by slowing down and breathing, your body will know what to do and try to restore balance.
Yeah, I've heard that kind of stated before in reacting versus responding, which I think is a challenge for many of us. And I guess I've always thought of it just in that context. When you hear something, instead of reacting to it, think about it and respond. But it seems like this all digs so much deeper into that whole concept of really understanding why you're reacting that way and giving yourself maybe the space, to understand how to, I guess, better react to the moment or respond to the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we say things like think before you speak, you can't think before you speak. We have to first do this body awareness piece and access the part of our brain that actually thinks. And so even if we're working with young people, just consider those phrases and how that might not be feasible and accessible for all of us. First, regulate, relate, and then we can relearn some of the things that we've been taught.
Do you think, I know that we in FCS take focus on mindfulness and practicing mindfulness, and it seems like some of the practices in response to our body is that you recommended: grounding, tracking, feeling the senses throughout your body. Would the practice of, is that essentially practicing mindfulness? And would that help people, I think, connect to this a little bit better? Like, is there value in that as well?
Yeah, I think you can connect it to the field of mindfulness. I think the mindfulness, it's mindfulness. So there's still a preference to train the mind over the body. But I think some of the activities can be shared. I think there's some really interesting intersections between mindfulness and trauma and somatics that I would love for our program area to explore more and really link to a larger strategy of community resiliency. And so there's another resource and recommendation for you is the community resiliency model. And hopefully in 2021, there might be more programming around that. But if anyone has questions and wants to reach out, I'm here as a resource and support.
That's so great. And it's also really interesting that I immediately drew that connection and stopped thinking about the body again, because it's just not, I think, where we tend to go when we really approach this sort of stuff. It's like, why am I thinking this way? But it's like, why is your body reacting this way? It's like really retraining how we understand how we approach things. So yeah, this is really valuable. I'm so glad you were able to be here to share this, especially, I think this is always helpful, right? But now it's like trial by fire. We're in a very contentious year. And so, why not try, I think, now to get a better understanding of, where we are and how we're feeling about things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And I just appreciate the opportunity to quickly provide you with a lot of information.
Thanks, Whitney. So we will share, if Whitney is okay with that, in the maybe links below. We can share a couple of resources on this, and her contact information will be there as well. So if this is a topic that you want to learn more about, that information will be there for you, and then you can reach out to Whitney as well. So thank you so much to everybody for taking time to join us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month.